Everyone now have their seats. Everyone's comfortable. PA's working well. Always important to check. I remember explaining how a GST was going to work in a little tin hall out the back of my country electorate once, way out near the Queensland border, and a storm rolled in from the north across the plains in the gloom, tin shed, down came the rain. I thought they probably can't hear me, so I yelled out through the gloom to a fellow down the back I could just pick out, "Can you hear me over this racket?" And he yelled out, "Yes, I can, and I'm pretty keen in view of what you're saying to change places with someone who can't." Can I sincerely welcome you to the 2024 TimFischerOration in this majestic Great Hall. It is terrific to see the place full. I think that is a tremendous compliment to those who have organised it and pulled it together, but it says something too about your respect, a respect I share for the former Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, Tim Fischer, and indeed I think it's a great thing that we honour him in this way. It's also terrific that you are plainly interested in the great ideas. Every society is the product of great ideas. The better the ideas, the better the society will be. The worse the ideas, the lesser the society will be. So, as we gather in this historic venue, we do look forward to a really interesting evening of inspiring discussions. Your presence makes this event truly special. Thank you. This is a biennial event which honours the life and extraordinary contribution that Tim Fischer made to this country. The inaugural lecture was back in 2022 and it was sold out. This is sold out. So that is just terrific. Now I would like to invite Paul Giroua to up here. Not at this point? Okay, all right. Well, in his absence, can I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to their elders past and present. On that note, can I introduce you to one of the most persuasive men I've ever met, Father Tony Percy, who persuaded me to do the inaugural oration at Tim Fischer's funeral. I think I can give that secret away. I could hardly say no in those circumstances. Tony.
The reason I'm here is because Judy Fischer couldn't be here tonight. So I thought that what I would do very briefly, because we want to hear Helen, who's come a long, long way, and a lot of you have travelled long, long distances, and we're very grateful and delighted that you're here. What I thought I would do is tell you the first time that I met Tim Fischer and the last time that I spoke with him. Well, the first time I spoke with him and the last time I spoke with him. So I was a younger priest back in the 1990s. I had different colour hair then, needless to say. And Tim was out there at Young, the cherry capital of Australia, and he was spruiking Dr. Hewson's Fight Back package, and it had a GST involved, and I simply stood up and asked a question, are these taxes going to apply to school fees? And so Tim answered the question, and then after that came round to the table and invited me to come to this magnificent place, and we struck up a wonderful friendship. Sporadic because of the nature of his work and mine as well. So that was the first time, and the last time was 2 days before he died, on the 22nd of August 2019. And he rang me to tell me about the funeral arrangements, these sort of elaborate funeral arrangements that he had in place. To which I said, "When do you think you will die?" And he said, "Oh, it'll be about Christmas. It'll be about Christmas." And 2 days after that, he died. And that was Tim. That's what he was like. He never drew attention to himself. He was very selfless. And that's why we've named this oration after him. Every second year we have it, the Tim Fischer Oration for Ethics in Public and Political Life. And that word ethics comes from ethos, which means character. Character. And character comes from competence and courage, which we're going to hear from Helen tonight, who's very competent and very courageous. And Tim was that. He was a man of immense goodness. He was a very, very, very good person. He had terrific faith. He was a Catholic. He had a tremendous faith in God. He really believed in God. And he was a man who was given over to public life. He really gave himself over to help people. I can think of numerous stories where I asked him to do something which was a little bit difficult, off track, and he would just sort of get on his bike and do it. Nothing was too difficult. So thank you for coming to honour this man, but also, as John said, to the contest of large ideas, which is very, very important. So thanks for coming again.
I can't help recalling that at the time of that GST debate, when you asked him a question and you said he answered, I was his deputy. Can I just ask, did he give you the correct answer? Some of my colleagues in the room will remember that, we all need correcting from time to time, especially on the complexities, as I recall, of the GST when we were designing it. Sometimes I felt we were designing it as the plane took off, or designing the plane as the plane took off. Can I move to thank the major supporters? An event like this doesn't happen without people getting in behind it. So on behalf of the Catholic Archdiocese of Canberra and Goulburn, can I express appreciation to Ord Minnett, to the Catholic education at the Archdiocese of Canberra and Goulburn, the PM Glynn Institute, Campion College up in Sydney, and Mr David Smith MP and his team for providing the theatre for the very interesting students' pre-event, which I was privileged to sit in on. Can I extend a formal welcome to His Excellency Archbishop Charles Balvo, Australian Apostolic Nuncio, His Grace Archbishop Christopher Prowse, Archdiocese of Canberra and Goulburn, to Ross Fox, Director of Catholic Education, Archdiocese of Canberra and Goulburn, Australian Catholic University ACT Associate Professor Darius von Guttner, Mr Michael Casey, Director of PM Glynn Institute, Mr Peter Kane, Member of the ACT Legislative Assembly, Warren Truss MP, National Liberal Party of, or Liberal National Party of Australia. It's always tempting for me to get those two the wrong way round, or should I say the right way round. The Honourable Matthew Ryan, Mason Cox, former President of the New South Wales Legislative Council, Ambassador De La Vega from the Embassy of the Philippines, and I think Head of Mission as it stands at the moment, CEOs and directors of various Catholic organisations and agencies. Can I also particularly thank the many who purchased student-sponsored tickets? There are many young people with us tonight. That is a tremendous thing. You are growing up in challenging times, and you're shortly to hear an address that will very much seek to engage your minds in an age when often we rely too much on feelings. Getting the balance right is important for individuals and for society at large. The schools represented here today is quite a list, and I take great delight in this. I'm fascinated and I deeply enjoy the business of being a sounding board and an encourager to emerging leaders. The Trinity Catholic College in Goulburn, Morris College, Marisi, is that how? There you go, I should know that. I should know it well because I have friends who work there. College, St Clair's College, St Francis Xavier College, Darramellon College, St John Paul II College, St Mary MacKillop College, university students, and Warrane College. Now, to get technical for a moment, you will have opportunities for questions, and amazingly, you're not even required to wait until the end of the address. You can start formulating them before our guest has even spoken, if you like. You will find on your seats a minty. There you go, not one of the ones that you chew, or menti, more accurately. And what you do with it is you use the camera on your phone to scan the QR code on the flyer. You submit your questions through the provided link. This feature is now open. And for those of you who are genealogically challenged and you're worried about how to use this, find the youngest person in the room and you'll be fine. Questions can be voted on. There you go. This is, after all, the Parliament. And those with the most votes will be pushed to the top of the list, reflecting the interest in that particular question. Now, it's my very great honour, and it is a great honour, having heard her speak now, the clarity of her thinking, the generosity of her spirit, her vast knowledge, Dr. Helen Alvaré. A brief bio: she's a legal scholar specialising in family law, culture and women's issues, the Professor of Law at Antonin Scalia Law School, George Mason University. She previously served as spokesperson for the US bishops on pro-life and family issues. She's a published author and frequent speaker on topics related to marriage, parenthood, and women's rights. She's recognised for her contributions to the field of law and public policy, particularly in the area of family and religious freedom. I can add to, having only met her literally in the last couple of hours, she's a person of enormous generosity of spirit, great warmth and charm. So I think you are in for a real treat. But again, I say, let our minds be open and willing to be challenged, because we live in a world that is suffering from a surfeit of emotion and feeling at the expense of clear, calm reason. May I invite you up?
Greetings. I am so honored to be here, but also really humbled because it is an honor of such an admirable and larger-than-life figure, Tim Fischer. I tried to read a good deal about him before I got here, and I understand why you perpetuate his legacy so much. Of particular appeal to me as a public servant of sorts, a public academic, a Catholic, and as a mother, was the way he coordinated his vocation to his family with his equally God-given vocation to politics and the welfare of Australia overall. Few people in any country have that kind of a record in public life. So with genuine humility in light of this example, combined with a desire for my own vocation to give back, allow me to offer you some reflections about our part, yours and mine, in promoting the common good by means of what I'll call noble actions, nothing less than that, noble actions in public life. Being a professor, let me organize this for you. My thoughts are going to come in three parts. First, to briefly identify our reasons for fearing, stepping out into the public conversation. Second, offering reasons for overcoming those fears. And third, promptly frightening you again by suggesting that the set of issues that need particular attention today, because they're one of the leading determinants of social health and religious freedom, are what I'm going to call, sort of as a body, the sexual expression issues, whether it's contraception, non-marital births, abortion, same-sex relations, or transgenderism. And here, I'm going to elaborate not only upon their importance, but how we might engage in public discourse on these truly neuralgic matters. And I'll be trying to draw there from my scholarship and portfolio of the last 35 years. So beginning with the matter of legitimate trepidation to step out there into the maelstrom. Here, we face a threat, in my view, way worse than ignorance or mean-spiritedness, a seeming rejection of reason itself. As in the coming true of G.K. Chesterton's early 20th century prediction, which I'm sure some of you have read, he said, "We shall soon be in a world in which a man may be howled down for saying that 2 and 2 makes 4, in which people will persecute the heresy of calling a triangle a 3-sided figure, and they will hang a man for maddening a mob with the news that the grass is green." I remember once Richard John Newhouse, a prominent, he had been a Lutheran pastor who became a Catholic priest in the United States. He used to say the French philosophes of the Revolution of the 18th century would wake up shocked that it was the Catholic Church that was the largest defender of freedom and reason in our times. And that's what we're facing so often. It is a stunner that things have come to this, but we can't allow it to be a conversation stopper. Because whether simply as human beings or as religious believers in a God who perfectly coordinates faith and reason, we are wired to believe our eyes, to be reasonable, which disposition then gets confirmed by the unfolding of events, by history, in our own lives and on larger stages. Of course, there's going to be holdouts, but this is where courage, persistence, research, and well-honed communication skills come in. Because what's the alternative? Leaders and influencers there will always be. In my country, we would say, if we don't lead, if we don't influence, then for sure Hollywood will, the media will, the White House will, and at the bottom of the barrel, the Kardashians will, okay? If we don't, they're going to have the last word. And I'm sure you have close Australian analogies. And as I'll unpack at the end of my talk, I can testify that it is not pointless to step into the arena. If you have been gifted and burdened with a vocation for influence beyond your personal circle, you really ought not to stiff-arm the universe. After all, when Jesus himself is asked to prioritize God's commands, he links to love God with our whole heart and soul, and our neighbor as ourselves. So it's really Christianity 101 to be the woman or man for others. And make no mistake, it's a radical call, because we're supposed to be called to be like Jesus, and Jesus wasn't just marginally nicer than your average human. He is, as Scripture reminds us, the Son of God who becomes human and who dies a ghastly death for the likes of us. Okay, this is not just marginally nicer. So is it really too much to ask that if you've been given insights and a voice that might assist your neighbor, that you use them? And let me mention here, there's other upsides in addition to fulfilling the vocation God has given you. When you have a vocation to public life, one of the signs I've found is that your output often exceeds your input. I have so many examples of this now in moving on to 4 decades of this. About 10 years ago, I wrote a book about Catholic women in the United States, but I opened with a chapter about my fear of becoming a mother. It was a huge fear. 11 years later, I'm at some conference in New York, and a woman says to me, I read your book. It had a big influence on me, that first chapter, and then she says, this is Maria, my daughter. She's 10. Now, talk about your output exceeding your input, you know? I just wrote a chapter about my own fears. And a vocational call also comes with its own fun. When I was regularly testifying for all the U.S. bishops before the United States Congress, I would leave the Capitol completely energized, with a sense of having great fun engaging in the back and forth with people who agreed with me, with people who disagreed with me. My office mates were horrified at the thought of going to testify, often before a hostile congressional committee. And for me, it was the most fun I had all week. A sign of your vocation. And don't worry that God will demand more of you than you could possibly give. Even the most iconic scripture about human beings' vocation to care for others, the Good Samaritan story, has a limiting principle. That is, you're being asked to answer the needs of those strewn on the path that you're traveling. God does not ordain that you be a jack of all trades and master of none, or that you solve every problem swirling about in the world. In fact, that's a recipe for being completely ineffective, okay? I had a little lesson on this recently, a wonderful exchange with a bishop from Illinois. I was speaking in Chicago, and while I was renting my car, I passed the booth where, the man checks you out and says you're legit to leave with this rental car. But while I was waiting, he was dressed in something close to rags. He was on the phone, not paying any attention to me, and he was near tears talking to someone who was a creditor to whom his mother owed money for a car. And he was in panic and tears explaining that his father had just died and that his mother didn't have the money, but if they waited till he got paid next week, he would have the money. And I was just so torn up by listening to him that after he checked me out, I went to an ATM machine and I came back with the car money in cash. And he was gone. And I wasn't about to leave cash with just anybody there, so I felt I had missed my opportunity. I was expressing my frustration with this to this bishop I was doing a gig for in Chicago, and he said to me, "Helen, that's not the guy strewn in your path to help today. There will be others." Right? It's its own limiting principle in a sense. And finally, on the matter of our trepidation to enter the public sphere, remember, the horizon is not wholly bleak. Discourse is not dead. Nobility has its fans still. When reason and principle and unselfish love and truth make their appearance, there is still room for them, especially if you play the long, consistent game and it's not about you. And I'll touch on this in a few minutes. Now to my second point. In some sense, I'm really sorry to tell you that public and political arenas today are in particular need of people who can discuss the tough sexual expression issues. I did not ask for this brief in my life, but it kept coming to me and being laid at my door. This is important because the current sexual orthodoxy, the one adopted by my government and by some of yours, is a leading cause of the suffering of a lot of vulnerable people. And also because Christian witness on these matters has become a leading driver of the effort to constrain religious freedom. On the first point, reason and empirical scholarship affirm what faith also holds, that when you separate sex from marriage, from parenting, when you put adults' interests over children's, when sex is severed from tomorrow, from commitment, from children, from family, from kin, even from love, things go seriously awry. And it turns out that what passes for human progress so often, the technology of contraception and abortion, government programs at the back door trying to help children when adults realizing of their own interests at the front door have hurt them, that all of these things, this so-called progress, doesn't really work. It's just not a match for the Creator's plans, which is what? Well, he could have done otherwise, remember. We always learn more by distinction than by description. He could have done it otherwise, but what did he do? He creates a two-sexed human race, similar but different, but built for relationship, for reminding each of them and all of us in our life that no one of us is all there is. None of us. No one of us exhausts what it means to be human. We are always needing to go out of ourselves to another who's like us, but who also requires patience, investigation, understanding, and the gifts that the other can bring. The Creator's plan also apparently includes putting the creation of new life together with the union of a man and a woman in such a way that sex intrinsically poses the question to the couple, what about tomorrow? Which ends up being a really healthy thing for relationships. And the Creator renders children quite vulnerable, requiring long-term and joint care, and instills in children the desire to love and be loved by the people who brought them into the world, if at all possible. Yet contemporary progress, even with all its technology and commitment to prevent new life or extinguish it when it's very young, even with all its promises to enhance love between men and women and to attain better parenting, contemporary progress has led to, in my own country, more non-marital pregnancy, more abortion, more single parenting, still very high rates of unintended pregnancy, more cohabitation with its attendant higher risks of infidelity, violence, and later divorce, less marriage, and more divorce. And note that the vulnerable members of society suffer every one of these more than people with more education and more money. In fact, in the US, it is not race that marks the difference between those who have money and education and those who do not. It is rather the single greatest factor is family structure. That is the presence of parents who take care of children together for their long, stable lives. In other words, the very people the new sexual orthodoxy claimed it would help are the very people that it is hurting the most. Other kinds of social progress, too, concerning not just poverty, but crime, educational attainment, emotional balance, long-term economic welfare, all importantly depend upon adults committing themselves first to the welfare of the children they make. Empirical studies are firm on this, and in the UN we now have agreement, or in the United States, we now have agreement between the think tanks on the left and the think tanks on the right on this precise question. Undoubtedly, then, sexual expression and familial matters need all the help they can get in the public square today. And because Christianity is one of the last voices refusing to bow to this new orthodoxy, due to its commitment to the vulnerable, to truth, and to love, Christian religious freedom is being hotly challenged. But let me pause for a moment and ask, why do you think these matters are so neuralgic in our times? Doesn't that, every once in a while, don't you say, why is this the issue that dominates the news so often? The focus of so much rights talk, the focus of so much repression of religious freedom? And why Christianity's particular response, which was largely mirrored across the world until it seems just about 10 minutes ago by governments and the people alike, is particularly hotly contested right now? I think the range of answers to this question supports my proposal that sexual expression requires particular dedication today as a public discourse issue. First, maybe the answer is theological. Some of you have heard in a letter to the Italian Cardinal Caffarra, who was setting up the John Paul II Institute years ago for study of marriage and family, he wrote to the last seer of Fatima, Sister Lucia, and asked her for prayers. And instead, he got this letter back that said, quote, "Father, a time will come when the decisive battle between the kingdom of Christ and Satan will be over marriage and the family, and those who work for the good of the family will experience persecution and tribulation." Digging deeper, why might this be so? One thought I have is that the current challenges to Christian norms are in essence a denial of God's creative sovereignty, a reprise of human original sin in the garden. It's our version of, I will tell you what is good or evil. I will reject your plan for creation and human flourishing. I will deny your two-sexed creation, that their union can lead to new life, that human life has any intrinsic value. And without getting all eschatological on you, let me say that it worries me that I may be onto something here. Another possibility is that because God makes the human race in his image and likeness, when we obscure his design for the human race, maybe we're going to have more trouble glimpsing him. And we're going to have more trouble then understanding ourselves as being made to love like God. In other words, when we obscure or deny the existence of two sexes, similar but differently gifted, designed to live in a permanent, interpenetrating love, whose unity brings about new life, we might also really be obscuring God's Trinitarian nature. And this also means we're going to get confused about God's love, which, remember, is the love he also charges us to show one another, as in, love one another as I have loved you. In short, this is fundamental stuff. St. Paul confirms this in the letter to the Ephesians in chapter 5 when he says, marriage between a man and a woman is some kind of privileged glimpse of the relationship between God and ourselves. So when the government or others try to shut down a Christian witness on sexual expression matters, this is not just for us a, oh darn, we are so offended that our norms are ridiculed kind of thing. It's rather a matter of both obscuring architectural elements of our faith and silencing a voice that the most vulnerable people in society really need to be out there. And now to my last point, how to meet this challenge. I'm going to begin by noting how we're presently doing it, and then offer some suggestions for improvement regarding both content and process. As to how the churches are presently doing it, I'm not overly satisfied, which, believe me, is putting it nicely. Far too often, I think, and I see this in the United States very much, our churches, our religious leaders say things like, we have a rule, And we can't violate our rule, and we know how much the public likes it when we have a rule. Or second, they'll say, the pastor or the bishop or the pope insists, and of course we know the public loves that too. And there we let it rest. Unsurprisingly, onlookers are not impressed. Instead, they characterize our norms as unthinking, unkind, ancient, irrelevant, or, wait for it, unchristian. Especially, they say, we are not respecting women or persons experiencing gender dysphoria or same-sex attraction. They frame our demands for religious freedom as asking for a right to do wrong. I think there's two leading points we need to make in response. First, as discussed above, we need to remind onlookers that our norms are not mere moralism, by which I mean man-made rules, but rather they're architectural to our faith, because understanding human beings in the way God made them is the way to understand how God loves us, and we're supposed to love him and one another. Asking us to live our romantic and familial lives differently is like asking us to practice another religion. Second, we need to communicate that our norms are loving. There's a couple subpoints to this. One is already noted, they are loving in fact, as measured by more empirical studies than we've ever had to our credit in the history of this kind of research. When a man and a woman refuse to sexually objectify one another, when they remember that sex points to tomorrow, even when a particular encounter is not procreative, but that it's simply one of the constituting features of a sexual relationship, when they're faithful to one another, when they're permanent, when parents allow a child to grow rather than to resort to abortion, when they provide a child a stable home. When these things happen, the human beings involved, especially the most vulnerable, benefit enormously and in every way. They're provided the strong foundation from which to go out into the world and face its inevitable difficulties. And these practices, as I've said before, are probably the most efficacious way to help the poor in the long run overcome the wealth, income, educational, and employment gaps that we're seeing in society. Honest scholars really don't disagree with these conclusions, but we need to sound them all the same because there's a lot of dishonest denials of them. Two, we have to communicate that our norms are social justice norms. It is not a case of Catholic social justice nice, Catholic family norms mean, okay, which I think is a big theme out there. From the beginnings of Christianity, this has been understood that our sexual expression norms are social justice. Christian sexual expression norms were greeted with particular affection by women and by the poorest members of society, including slaves. In the marvelous words of Yale classic scholars Sarah Rudin, in a book I really recommend, Paul Among the People, she writes, Christian teachings offered a new way of thinking that must have been quite exciting, a hope for something beyond exploitation, materialism, and violence, a plan not for competing in purity and the denial of life, but for the sharing of life in full. It offered a chance not to be treated as a thing. In fact, during its earliest centuries, according to the eminent historian Kyle Harper in his book From Shame to Sin, which I highly recommend, The Transition from the Roman to the Christian Family Ethic, and Rodney Stark's on Christianity, Christians were distinguished by their conspicuous chastity. Isn't it fascinating that it's become a distinguishing element of ours, almost 2 millennia later? It's risen again. Christians distinguished themselves from the Roman manner of handling sex, marriage, and parenting, which had different rules for masters than for slaves, different rules for men than for women. There was not so much right or wrong when it came to sex and family and marriage as there was honor and shame. And this was wholly dependent on your sex and your social class. But for Christians, things were different. Not only respecting sex and marriage, but for all social justice. Why? Because of the way Jesus instructed them to love all persons without distinction. They didn't distinguish between loving them in the family and loving them outside the family. That love, in every case, had to be radical self-emptying for the good of the other, acknowledge the sacredness of the human body, and as Paul wrote in Romans 1, respect the created world as God had made it. Thus, according to historian from Princeton, Peter Brown. You may have read some of his stuff on early Christianity. This radical love translated itself across categories. He points out that the early fathers, who were the most insistent in their sermons on how people treated one another in the family, were also the most insistent on Christians' obligation to care for the poor. Thus, for Christianity, the emphasis on celibacy, on martyrdom, on the chastity for all, equally. Thus, the Irish bishops, who captured this so brilliantly in their document, Love is for Life, when they simply characterized Christian familial norms as an application of the Good Samaritan principle to our romantic interests and to the family. I would add that these persons are those persons that some of us are most likely to encounter strewn on our path of life, and who we will affect most deeply and indelibly. Of course, we all have an obligation to people beyond the family, and some of us are lucky enough to work full-time in those ministries. But it's really easy for us to forget to exercise justice and love in that first society, meaning the people you're running across on your way to the bathroom and the kitchen every day. Otherwise, we practice love in dreams, but not so much love in action. In short, there is not now, nor has there ever been, a sliver of daylight between Christian sexual and familial norms and what we've come to call our social justice norms. We are called to show radical Christian love in both arenas. Finally, about the how of speaking to this, the process, not as much the contents. This is equally important, a lesson I learned the really hard way when I would get on TV or in some kind of public lecture and do it the wrong way, and absolutely crash and burn, make a fool out of myself, embarrass my own people. So I want to share 4 brief points in conclusion on this. First, the fundamental lesson. Get it very clear in your head that your work is a service, not an exercise in pride or triumphalism. This is not a status-oriented, grasping mentality that you should use when sharing these things in public. Perhaps surprisingly, humility, not normally considered a virtue in public life, leads to better work, more enjoyment, less hand-wringing, and over the long run, more courage and energy for the task at hand. And of course, this shouldn't surprise us in light of that mysterious passage from Philippians describing how Jesus, quote, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be grasped. Rather, he emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, humbled himself, becoming obedient to death. Because of this, God greatly exalted him. That's our way. Okay? I've certainly experienced this in my own life. When I sought to write the Great American Law Review article, to be best in my field, to publish in the highest outlet, I was constantly plagued with feelings of inadequacy. What topic should I use to get the best chance of publishing? Who did I need to know? Who's doing better than me? What are the scholars coming up behind me who could best me? But I had a long come-to-Jesus talk with a friend of mine who actually worked at the Secretariat of State at the Vatican. She said to me, are you really trying to do God's will or just make it in your own field? Had I considered the most pressing needs of the church in the world, areas that I might be willing to enter where others feared to tread? She recalled me to a version of service which meant not just worrying about the prestige, but getting the writing out there. And sharing what needed to be shared and sticking it on platforms where everybody could get it, which is what I did. And she was so right. And over the long run, lawyers and judges and even other academics looking for a voice that didn't just parrot everybody else and that provided a solidly sourced competing view began to rely on my work, even if only as a foil. I would also add that a vocational mindset's better motivating. You are trying to serve the truth, the vulnerable, Christ, the church. These are big responsibilities. You will be motivated to be the smartest person in the room on your topic. You will be motivated to know the objections to your arguments and to be ready to respond to them. Because this is not about you. This is about the needs and the welfare of others, so you just have to get to work. Related to this is my advice when you are really living your vocation. Don't worry about your immediate impact. Do your best and trust that by virtue of that alone, someone is benefiting to the work you're called to. I remember once speaking on a very popular political debate show in the US. My opponent cut me off at every second. And I had the impression that I said nothing. And in the old days when this wasn't online and I had to actually order a transcript, I ordered a transcript to see what I said, and it was things like, and then I would just be cut off before I could get out a full word. The reason I ordered the transcript is because I was getting all these pieces of fan mail for that particular interview. They said things like, "You kept your dignity. You made me proud to be a Catholic woman. Thanks for representing us." I figured out that it was my manners, a pleasant look on my face, an attempt to do my best that was more important than those great arguments I never got to say, okay? That tone, style mattered. Also, being honest and thorough and fully researched and maintaining your composure support another way of engaging in public, which is playing the long game, right? In the short game, it seems like you have to make a big splash, maybe even be combative, used unnuanced, even sensational language, spread yourself thin so that wherever things are happening, you're there. Ignore the weaknesses in your position, impugn the motives of your opponents, win the favor of those people who have the greatest influence. I could go on. But I am old enough now to see that whole arc of history that everyone's talking about, to see how behaving as a principled player in public dialogue is not only a gift to the long-term tone of the public square, but is also effective. One of the things I've learned about being Catholic in the public square on all sorts of neuralgic issues is that we will never, as religious folks, be fully loved or trusted by either political party or fully by the media. We're often perceived to be irrational simply because we're people of faith. Our arguments get double and triple checked. We're told that we have to live up to the "what would Jesus do" standard. This can seem super constraining in the long run. Others meet behind closed doors with party leaders who trust them. Others stretch or ignore the truth. Others don't get measured against God himself. But in the long run, it turns out that these constraints were just the thing. I had to approach political leaders in all camps with friendship and with an ability to treat my issues in a way to explain them to them as a commitment to human rights that I trusted they wanted to uphold. I had to do my research and triple check it with the goal of being the best prepared person in the room. I had to cure my abrasive, I know better personality in favor of beginning with respect and listening to where the other person was coming from. Then, after doing this for a while, I noticed that people were respecting me as a principled player. A pro-legal abortion Catholic female columnist at the New York Times, who was kind of a big deal, began to refer to me in her column as the person you could really talk to on this issue and get an honest answer. Talk show hosts at the usually really hostile National Public Radio were asking me for annotated bibliographies on the topics that they were covering and willing to have me in to debate these issues. Don't get me wrong, these results are neither guaranteed nor immediate, nor were they a feature of all my work, but they happened over time, all the same. My final thought, learn to communicate boldly and briefly. Communications is not a lesser intellectual discipline. It's crucial. Say, for instance, in public, society is fortunate to have our witness on these disputed matters, and then explain why. Say, truth and empirical scholarship are our best friends, and then show them that. Do not just blather on about what you know. Tell people what you want them to believe and why they should be confident in believing it. And at all times, remember, it's really not about you. It's about him and everyone that he's given to you to love and to serve. Thank you very much.
Well, I suspect that all of us feel challenged. That's a very good thing. None of the big issues in life are ever satisfactorily resolved if we don't grapple with the big questions. So, Helen, thank you from me. And I just note that John Donne, some 500 years ago, made the observation that no man is an island, we're all part of a whole. And radical individualism, the idea that somehow we can be God over ourselves, has produced a very great deal of misery and increasingly an incoherent society because we're not actually up to the task. Thank you too for reminding us that the way in which we engage, how we say it, matters as much as what we say if we're to connect with other people out of concern for them. An observation I can't help making is that in this place that I served in for so many years as a minister means to look after others. The idea that cabinet ministers are there not for themselves but to minister to others reflects a great deal of wisdom. And the Prime Minister is the prime server of others when the role is properly understood. And perhaps it tells us something about our own value system when we say we raise our children to think that they're the centre of their own universe. When we see politicians behaving like that, we say, hey, don't you get it? It's really, you're meant to be serving us. We recognise how skewed that value is. Now, just to prove that real miracles happen, one other thing I should do, Menti, not Minty, you've got the forms, engage. There will be those who really want to put up powerful positions or perhaps disagreements. I think you've seen that our guest tonight is more than capable of dealing with those, so feel free. Now, I just want to say to you that if you ever doubted that miracles happen, I'm about to demonstrate that they do indeed happen. I am a former Coalition MP, and Chris Yeoman is a former ABC journalist, and I regard him as one of the finest and most decent and thoughtful men that I know, and I completely and absolutely trust him. So, Chris, I think you're coming up now to conduct the Q&A.
Well, thank you, John Anderson. I have to say, every time I'm on stage with you, I feel short, fat, unattractive and inarticulate. And I have to say to you, Helen, that was fantastic, but I think it's the Kardashians here as well. Okay. Can I start by saying one of the things that gets thrown up so often to me in public life about the Catholic Church's position is how can you talk to us about your ideals when you have so conspicuously failed to live up to them, particularly your leadership?
Yes. So that's a many-part response, and you probably don't know that I've worked with my own home diocese reforming their response to particularly the sexual abuse crisis. And I continue to work with one of the dicasteries in Rome precisely on improving certain communities in the church response to this. So the first thing to say is that the church is properly ashamed of this, and it would take all night to rehearse the various types of failings and the timing on that. But it is in response mode in a good way. I've been part of this and seen big changes in the particular projects that I've worked on. We could also say two other things broadly, because I know there's many questions. This is worth hours of its own. One is that if you can't trust a group of people or a message that has failed in some respect, then there's nothing in the world that you can hang your hat on at all. There is no truth, there is no guidance, there are no role models, because every group and institution has failed in some dramatic way. The other thing to say is none of this tarnishes Jesus Christ as the center of the universe in our lives. To throw him out, the expression throwing the baby with the bathwater, to fail to recognize the genius, the call, the centrality of the Catholic message would be to go too far with this. So those are just some very broad responses, I would say, to that.
All right, look, I want to take people's questions, and we're getting a lot of them, so I'm going to go straight to those. And the top one at the moment that I have is, how does it feel with many young people in this room that are pro-choice and are pushing for what's said in this question, a positive change in the future, to have your position?
Yeah. So we have the same debate in the United States. To me, there's a lot of difficult issues, but I'm going to be frank, abortion is not one of them. When we're confronted with what is human, our only response must be respect. And of course, at the foundation of that is not to destroy the other. The idea that the life we're talking about is particularly small or particularly vulnerable or inconvenient or overly expensive, I don't find that those are good arguments for violating another's human right because of its size or its timing or its expensiveness or its inconvenience. To me, as a lifelong feminist, I think my father was appalled when I announced this sometime in the late 60s. The idea that abortion has become, in the US, it's almost a shorthand for feminism. It's so appalling. It's such an offense to women that you take what makes us different and call it a disability, that we are able to nurture and give birth to a child. The idea that terminating a vulnerable life, giving the right to terminate to a person who is charged with the greatest care for that life, at this incredibly vulnerable time, and calling that a human right, I have to say, I just don't find it difficult to say this is appalling. And that I think we need to extend our moral imagination, no matter how small, no matter how inconvenient, to what is human. So I married a pro-choice husband. I have many friends who are pro-choice. My husband came over to our situation, my pro-life beliefs, more because he began to be appalled at the human rights of the issue. I never berated him on it. And I just sincerely hope that over time there is conversion on this. It's all, I could go on. I've dealt with the issue for decades.
Yeah, and we'll try.
We need to move on.
We'll try and get through as many of these as
Yes.
we can. And you mentioned this in your talk. Can you give some examples now where evidence from social sciences backs up what you were saying about
Sure.
the social teachings of the church?
Sure. So I'll talk about one of the issues. We actually face it in the United States in the law, because some religious landlords, for instance, have refused to house cohabitants. And they will sue, claiming this is marital status discrimination. Interestingly, even in the mainstream press, and I include in that the New York Times, has acknowledged that cohabitation is the second biggest predictor of divorce in the United States. The number one predictor is very, very young marriage. But the second predictor is getting into a relationship where you've sort of put the cart before the horse. People think they're very close, they're in a sexual relationship, they've moved to each other's city, they're in the same apartment, but in fact it tends to be a relationship more of testing, a bit of surveillance. Are you really suitable? I'm not really committed. And it turns out that cohabitation sort of raises the divorce rate for that couple quite significantly. It also is the site of an extraordinarily higher amount of infidelity and violence, right? So I say this because that is sort of it reflects the idea that that we're made for something better. We're made for commitment. We're made for, sex being part of a truly unitive and a truly looking to tomorrow kind of relationship. And again, interestingly, on this question, the social science even makes it into the mainstream media. I could go on about some other issues. That's one example. On the question of the church's discussion of transgender issues right now, one on which Pope Francis is particularly active. In the US, we're seeing a huge backlash to sort of the medical industry of that. Lots of lawsuits on behalf of young people who are now trying to detransition, or understand that you can't really give a 16-year-old informed consent and say, is it okay if you're medicalized for the rest of your life and you will never be able to have a child or sexual pleasure? Will you be okay with that? They say, no, you can't actually do that in the context of respectable medical treatment. So the church's understanding that sex is a gift, that two-sexed humanity, it likewise is a gift. These sorts of things have an interplay with this kind of emerging evidence that it's not actually working for people's either mental or emotional or physical health.
And just briefly, you were talking last night too about the rates now of there not being fathers in households, and particularly catastrophic in some peoples in the United States, so black families now, and the effect that that's had on children.
Yes, so as I mentioned, the largest percentage of the gap between the better and lesser privileged economically, wealth, income, et cetera, is very much determined by stable parenting as a gift to children. The idea that the church's teaching on this was just either mean to single mothers, which is kind of ironic because we are the largest private provider of services to single mothers in the United States, the church is. The idea that this was mean or judgmental, or that we were just obsessed with, repressing people's normal sexual instincts. It turns out that when you don't put children's interests or vulnerable people's interests ahead of adults' interests, that the children actually do suffer. So that is another arena in which there's a lot of discussion about it now. In fact, there's this one very prominent economist on the left in the United States, Melissa Kearney, who just put out a book called The Two-Parent Privilege. And she sort of says, to sort of stave off criticism, don't worry, I'm on the left, I'm on the left, I'm on the left. And she says, but we really have to find a way to provide stable parenting for families. I know it's not a popular political issue, but it's something that the Catholic Church has been talking about likewise.
Okay, this one says, how can we support young Catholic men to become more respectful in their relationships?
I'm not going to put it at the feet of men. I'm going to say it's on both sides, right? I think both sexes are objectifying each other nowadays. I wouldn't have said that when I was growing up, but I think there's mutual objectification going on of the other person as not fully a person. To me, the church has rightly been accused, and Pope Benedict talks about this in interviews, and he's said something about it in his first encyclical, Deus Caritas Des, that, and I think John Paul II made apologies for it likewise, that the church has not always been sort of balanced or fully sort of like open and positive when talking about these issues, right? It was nervous, or it was silent, or it was just making cut and dried statements. I think remote preparation on these issues, having, comfortable, full-fledged conversations with young people about these from a very, in a Catholic vein from an early point. The Catechism talks about, sex education is something that parents are, like education generally, there is no substitute for parental first approach to this, and not waiting for the world at large to have its say. There's really no substitute for this, and it's got to be done remotely, and it has to be done with comfort, with the understanding that the God who made sex, marriage, and parenting did not make them to be dark or dirty or a source of shame, but rather something beautiful. And Catholics have to do this in a remote fashion, I think.
And this next question feeds into that. I think it says, how do we better catechize our youth, particularly young boys and girls who seem not to have been catechized at all by their parents and schools, as evidenced by some of these questions? And I hear this a lot about Catholic education. In fact, a theologian once said to me that he thought Catholic education inoculated children against Christianity.
Yes. In fact, in the United States, they say the second biggest religion is ex-Catholics, right? So, and it's not because lots of them didn't go to Catholic school. I've sent kids to Catholic school, and one kid who got bullied in a Catholic school, it pulled him out, he went to a public school. What I found is there's an expression, we say, osmosis is over. there's no such thing as saying, check the box, go to Mass on Sunday, check the box, go to Catholic school, and they're just going to have it all. Every parent homeschools to an extent. When my youngest went to public school, my quid pro quo was I was like, okay, I get it. It's time for you to move out of this one school and into another. I'm going to be talking to you. We're going to do theology 4 nights a week. And I used Benedict's Introduction to Christianity. I used Luigi Giussani's The Religious Sense. I used a couple of great books. And we had conversations about his faith in the horizon of the real world that he was living in. I think it's going to be a lot more involved for parents. It's going to be, you got to get your hands dirty on this, because what's going on in most places where you think you're checking the box isn't going to be enough.
This is clearly a big concern, because the next one says, as a migrant, I have realised the Australian Catholic schools are more secular than public schools. Oh. Clearly the government influence is hurting the next generation of kids. How do we solve this?
I won't go on further. I'll affirm what I said before. And the other thing is that the Catholic schools themselves, I know in the United States, we have second-guessed ourselves a lot on this. I don't know what you have in terms of movement here on that, but one of the things we now have is the creation of these things called classical schools, which also tend to be extremely attentive to intelligent, even very high-level conversations about the faith, reading primary documents of the church, having difficult conversations from a very early point. These schools are catching on like fire. National Public Radio was so struck by it that they did, when there was one in Hyattsville, which is a little town outside of DC, there was this kind of, declining, maybe about to shut down Catholic school. And a couple of theologians from the John Paul II Institute at Catholic University got a hold of it and turned it into this classical school. And now they cannot keep up with the people. I mean, they have to turn away the vast majority of people who attempt to get in, because it's a combination of tremendous intelligence and really great conversation about the Catholic life in the United States in this 21st century. And now we have dozens and dozens of these schools popping up around the country. That's been one of our answers.
Great. Just so people know, the way I'm going through with this is with top questions. You always get this thing at the ABC or anywhere else, Channel 9. Why are you asking that question? Why haven't you asked mine? I'm doing it from the top questions down, so that's why. And we won't get through all of them by any stretch of the imagination. And it's this one that says, given that you've done so much work with domestic violence survivors and single women, how does pro-life fit with that?
So it's very interesting. When you ask, if you look at Planned Parenthood, the largest abortion provider in the US, why do women have abortions? They say things like, this isn't a good time. The number one reasons, health and life reasons are together like under 2%. Everything else has to do with timing, lack of support of the father, money. So basically, with whether it's domestic violence questions, whether it's trafficking questions, these all have to do, and you have to get way behind it. By the time someone is in this situation is not a time to have this conversation. It has to be getting underneath and behind in time. All of these questions is talking about the dignity of women, and is talking about what you deserve as a woman, what you deserve in a romantic relationship, what you deserve as a spouse, as a parent, is helping them to understand about human sexuality. I did a lot of pro bono representation of poor single moms when I was full-time practicing as an attorney. And they did not expect enough of the father. They did not think they deserved to have commitment or that they couldn't reasonably expect it. That the way the marketplace for relationships was structured, if you didn't have sex, you weren't going to have a boyfriend. So this is a huge conversation about the dignity of women that has to take place way behind it. There's a I don't know if you have it here. Do you have the Endow movement here? It is a group of women who got together and decided to teach women about the dignity of women through the church's documents. And one of their most amazing ministries is to women in prison, many of whom have suffered domestic violence alongside other indignities in their life. And educating them about the dignity of women is a way of inoculating them further against getting involved in these kinds of scenarios. just punishing on the backside or even rehabilitation. And I teach this in family law. It's very hard to be effective after the fact. Prevention is the thing here. And respecting your body, its ability to create life, respecting yourself, all human life, is just an indispensable part of that.
Now, as I always find with these things, time rushes by and I have to finish up soon. But this question, I think that's one that many people ask, is with culture really normalising everything that goes against the teaching of the church and the church losing its say, do you have any hope in your arguments in the near future?
I do, because of human nature. So when you ask, if you look at some of the great sociological studies, especially of young people in the United States, one of the sociologists that I look at, Christian Smith at Notre Dame, Mark Regnaris at University of Texas, Brad Wilcox at UVA. These are huge, respected names in the movement. And you ask young people what they really want, it tends to coincide with what we're offering. It's their desire for that, the hope is there. You have much more awareness by religious families, and not just in Catholic families, but in so many religious families, that they have to get on this question much earlier. The fact in the United States, some of our statistics are actually getting better. The statistics on young people and sort of super early involvement in uncommitted sexual relationships, et cetera, they're actually been going in a positive direction. The rates of divorce have actually gone in a more positive direction. And just because you can't win a majority all the time isn't the reason to stop trying to help people in a good Samaritan fashion. We can't cure poverty. We haven't been able to stop rape and trafficking. But nobody's telling us to stop trying because we haven't fixed the problem. We really love these people who are in our path, Good Samaritan style. We owe them nothing less in any of these arenas than to give them what could answer their deepest human desires for love, for dignity, for equality, for freedom.
And how do we fight against the idea of sex being a pastime to restoring its place as a sacred union in a world that's becoming increasingly hypersexualized?
Yeah, the hypersexualization, the funny thing about that is how much of that is just driven by consumerism and materialism. You know, sex is a thing that you can get and enjoy, and buying certain things makes you sexy, right? There's a woman in Israel who writes about this. Her name is Eva Illush, and she has this fabulous, she has 2 books. One is called Consuming the Romantic Utopia, and the other one's called Love Hurts. And if you actually realize that the people who are doing this hypersexualization, they don't give a darn about you. They're trying to sell something. That's really what they're doing. They don't really care about whether you're happy. They don't care whether your children are well-adjusted. Sometimes I see this. We have I was saying, the public school down the street from me just won a battle in the courts that the teachers can secretly go along with the child's claim to transition sex and keep it from the parents. And I say to myself, oh my gosh, these teachers have these kids for a couple of months, maybe a year. They don't really care about their long-term future and their happiness. They don't have a stake in this. And yet they sort of are deciding over the people who gave birth to them and whose lifetime is devoted to these children? Really? And I feel the same way about hypersexualization. This is being sold by the people who make porn on the internet, by the people who sell any kind of product where sex is used to sell the product. Again, I go back to what I said, the church and other people, but I think the government's not going to do it, so it's probably going to be private people, and the churches are well positioned to do this. We have the networks, we have the schools, we have ways of talking to the parents. Have to start this at an early phase so people are aware of what's being sold to them. I can remember in one of my early feminist sort of exasperations with my daughter starting to watch this Disney stuff where the prince takes one look at the girl, she's thin, she's blonde, maybe she can sing, and he's like, I'm in love. And I remember when my daughter was 5, I go, do you see what's happening here? It's all about like preparing her for what was going to come. We don't want to overstress this. It's not the only issue there is. It happens to be what I work on in an academic fashion. But the world is so hypersexualized in a way that does not give a darn about your well-being. That in the same way we'd prepare children, not to go off the rails in other ways, right, that the world is offering them. We have to prepare this.
Look, final one from me is, so is it your call to arms? Is it time for the laity to step up and to fill this space?
The Catechism is so good on this. The Catechism of the Catholic Church says, especially in those arenas where there are laity and there are not clergy and religious, is where the charge to us to do things is the most pointed. And this is an arena where the parents, where Catholic schools, social services, healthcare, education, etc., this is where we are. There's simply not going to be clergy and religious to go around. And besides, on many of these issues, people who are lay people, who have lived in the world with these issues and in their own lives, are going to be quite credible. So obviously, I think the laity take the lead in this arena.
And to be judged by their deeds as well as their words.
Yes.
Well, look, Dr. Helen, you've come a long way. I know you've worked very hard, and we are extremely grateful for the time that you've given us this evening. So can you please all thank me in thanking Dr. Helen Alvaré.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Could I invite Archbishop Prowse up to the stage to offer a vote of thanks?
Thank you, John, and good evening, everybody. Today I've had the privilege of being listening to Dr. Alvaré 3 times, and I must say one of the quotes from the famous American writer comes to mind, Henry David Thoreau, when he says, "What you are shouts so loudly, I can hardly hear what you're saying." And that's very appropriate to you, Dr. Helen. Thank you so much. I feel a strength in humility with you. And you mentioned it in your talk, about being humble and a true understanding of the word humility, coming, near the earth, of the earth. But there's a strength in you, coming from your religious convictions as a dedicated Catholic woman, and I thank you so much for that. As you were talking tonight, I thought of another famous quote, this time from Paris, and we're all into Paris in a big way, aren't we, these weeks, from a former Cardinal Archbishop of Paris, Cardinal Lustiger, a convert from Judaism who became a Catholic and then became a former Cardinal Archbishop of Paris in France. And after the Vatican II Council, he was there at his highlight of his leadership, and there was a media interrogation of him, I suppose is the word, and the way he handled himself was great. And basically they were saying, why is the Catholic Church a generation behind everybody else all the time? And his lovely, bit of a silent moment of thought, and then he said, yes, there's certainly areas where we can certainly improve, but it could well be that the Catholic Church is a generation ahead of everybody else. And that sort of comment could still be said today. And your comments, Dr. Helen, certainly give me encouragement that the tide is slowly turning, but you use the word hope a lot, and I think that's an encouragement. So I thank you so much for that. While I have the microphone, I do want to thank very much Father Tony Percy, and even more so Janine Doyle, who have really put tonight together. Yes. And after John Anderson's introduction to Father Tony, we'll have to start calling him now the Great Persuader. Thank you, John Anderson, so much for gracing us with your company tonight, and Chris Ullman as well. We're very, very honoured to have the two of you animating tonight. Everybody, tonight is the vigil, tomorrow is the feast day of the Australian saint, St Mary of the Cross MacKillop. As we end tonight, Could I ask you please to stand up, and we'll say a little prayer, and I'll give you a little blessing before we go. Remember, of course, St. Mary of the Cross MacKillop's many quotes. One of them is quoted by school children so much: never see a need without doing something about it. So let's have a moment of silence to reflect on what's happened tonight, the great gems of tonight, the wisdom of tonight, and when we leave this great hall of the People's Parliament, what are we going to do? How are we going to change? What has tonight meant to us, and how might it change our attitudes and our approach to life? Let's do that in prayerful silence. And with St. Mary of the Cross MacKillop and Mary, the Mother of Jesus, let us pray together. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. A little blessing with 3 amens after each antiphon. The Lord be with you. Bow your heads and pray for God's blessing. May the Lord bless you and keep you. Amen. May he let his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. Amen. May he fill you with humble strength and peace of heart. Amen. May Almighty God bless you as we go our way, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Good evening. Thank you for coming.
Can I, on that note, simply say, firstly, apologies to the sound technicians for my way of drawing attention to you by tapping the mic. I sincerely apologise to them if that's mucked up their evening. And on that note, can I say thank you for coming. A Tim Fisherism would have been to have said, I salute you all. He had quite a bit of time in the military. And there will be another event in 2 years' time. As I understand it, the Great Persuader assures me that there will be.